Hey guys, Bicebump here, bringing you this 9.2 Unholy Death Knight beginner rotation guide. This is aimed to all of you out there who's maybe playing the Unholy Death Knight for the first time. Good effort, by the way. Or if you're returning after some time of downtime and you want to get a refresher on our rotation. I will cover all the fundamentals, talking about the main abilities we use, how we use them, how our resource system works, cooldowns, openers, and the Mythic Plus rotation. To jump straight into it, the Unholy Death Knight has three kind of primary resources. We have the runes, the runic power, and the festering wounds. To start off, the runes, there are 6 of them. You can see them down below your character portraits. It's these 6 skulls, green skulls beneath it. You use these on abilities such as Festering Strike, Scourge Strike, Army of Dead, and Death and Decay. How they work is that they are spent when you use one of those abilities and then takes 10 seconds to recharge. Luckily for us, the recharge time is reduced by haste. At 25% haste, for instance, it takes a rune 8 seconds to recharge. Furthermore, we have a proc called Runic Corruption. This makes it so that when you spend runic power, you have a chance of increasing your regeneration rate. It's quite interesting, just a side note, you always get exactly 0.9 runes back from getting one Runic Corruption proc. So, those are our runes. That's kind of like primary resource, I'd say. Whenever you spend one rune, that generates 10 runic power. And this runic power is something that we can then spend on other abilities, such as Death Call and Epidemic. The core of rotation is generally you spend your runes, that generates runic power, you spend that runic power, and so on, back and forth, back and forth. And then there's also the feedback loop, as I mentioned, that spending runic power has a chance of triggering runic corruptions. Right, so to the third resource, or resource, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but Festering Runes. So Festering Runes is a debuff we apply to enemies. It can stack up to 6 times. They don't do anything by themselves, however you can burst them. You apply them with Festering Strike, and then you can use Scourge Strike to burst them. That deals damage and generates some extra runic power. It's 3 runic power per wound you burst. So in addition to, having our rune suspend and rune power, we also build and burst Festering Wounds. And that's the core gameplay. Let's talk about what abilities actually do this and how you play them together. So we have Festering Strike, as I mentioned, that's used to build the wounds. We have Scourge Strike, which we burst the wounds with. And we have Death Call to spend the runic power we generate. That's kind of like the core Unholy rotation. Those 3 spells together. So how do we optimize this? Well, the whole point here is to manage the resource appropriately so that we don't overcap on anything. For runes, that's a bit special because you might imagine that, you can just spend the runes as soon as they come up. However, that's not necessary because at any given point in time, you can only regenerate 3 runes. So if you look at your runes below your character, if you spend all of them, you can see there's only 3 of them that actually recharge. Once those recharge, the next 3 is going to recharge. This means that if at any point in time you have 3 runes recharging, you are getting the most use out of that regeneration thing. And that's exactly what it means to not overcap on runes. If you have 3 recharging, you are fine. If you have less than 3, you need to spend your runes so that you start regenerating them again. Otherwise, you lose resources overall. For runic power, we want to focus to not generating runic power, so we go above the cap of 100. So let's say we're sitting at 90 runic power, we use a Festering Strike, which generates 20 runic power from the 2 rune dispense. That would technically take us to 110, which would then overcap us by 10 runic power. Don't want to do that either, that's resources we lose. Finally, Festering Wounds is something we also don't want to overcap. If you're sitting at 6 Festering Wounds and press a Festering Strike, that obviously won't apply any more Festering Wounds, and you kind of lose those. So Festering Strike should only ever be used if we have 3 or less Festering Wounds. When it comes to your Festering Wounds, we play around the Festering Wound equilibrium. Essentially, how many wounds do you usually want on your target? And I like to play quite high, which means that whenever I go to 3 or less Festering Wounds, I use Festering Strike, so I go up 4 or above, and then I use Scourge Strike to go down to 3, and then I use Festering Strike to go up again. The reason you play at a high wound count is because it sets up your Apocalypse window, making it much easier to use. The risk if you go down to 0 in your wound count is that Apocalypse is coming up, you'll starve on resources, there's not enough runes to press Festering Strike twice, and you have to sit there and wait for your cooldowns. To avoid that, we just play wounds at a high level without obviously overcapping, and that helps us to set up our damage windows better. Alright, now you might think, okay, so I need to manage my runes, I need to manage my runic power, and then I need to manage my festering wounds. What should I prioritize? So festering runes is kind of a non-starter because you can simply avoid pressing festering strike and instead go Scourge Strike without overcapping it, that's fine. When it comes to runic power versus runes, you can focus on either. So let's say you are sitting with 4 runes ready and are at 90 runic power, you could press a festering strike to get your runes down so that you start generating them again. Or you could use a death call to go below 90 and avoid overcapping that. And either choice is fine. I think technically it's a tiny bit better to prioritize the runes, but it doesn't really matter. Alright, so that's the core gameplay. Manage your resources, don't overcap on anything, and then you will do fine. Now, we also have a dot, which I haven't mentioned, it's called Virulent Plague. The thing with this is that it's kind of applied automatically in rotation when you pick up the normal talents. So you don't really need to care about it. But sometimes we need to press the ability called Outbreak. It applies a Virulent Plague. It happens a lot in AoE situations, happens if we have any spread cleave kind of thing. But you can pretty much always just ignore that. We also have a proc called Sudden Doom. This procs off your auto attacks, makes it so that your next Death Call or Epidemic, I'm going to talk about that ability later, doesn't cost any runic power. So it's kind of like a resource generating proc. You want to spend this as soon as possible, because if you don't, you have a risk of generating a new one which you overcap, which means that you kind of lose out on a proc. So whenever you get that, spend that as soon as possible. I do tend to prioritize not overcapping on runic power or runes before I use my proc, but it kind of really doesn't matter. You will notice I talk a lot about not overcapping, but you generally don't end up in situations where you need to make that decision. If you play properly, you will kind of never have too much, right? Alright, so now, core rotation down, let's talk about cooldowns. And I think there are 3 things we need to mention here. So first of all, every 45 seconds we have our main cooldown window, and that consists of Unholy Blight, Dark Transformation, and Apocalypse. You might now read those tooltips and you might ask yourself, hang on, Unholy Blight is 45 seconds, Dark Transformation is 1 minute, Apocalypse is even longer. How can they all align every 45 seconds? So it's because we have cooldown reduction abilities. Dark Transformation is natively reduced by using Death Call. Apocalypse is reduced by using Convocation of the Dead Conduit. It's also reduced by picking up the Army of the Damned talent. Bringing all that together in a single target rotation, if you play properly, they will all get brought about to 45 seconds and you can use them all together. And this is very good because they all scale with each other, so you get this big burst window every 45 seconds. If you do misalign them, you know, there's not worthwhile to kind of sit and wait for more than 10 seconds to get them all to align again. Apocalypse burst 4 wounds when you use it, and it will summon some armies of the dead minions. You want to always use this on 4 wounds, never on 3 or 2. We have Soul Reaper. I think, call this a cooldown or not, I don't know. But Soul Reaper is our execute ability. It applies a debuff to the target, and after 5 seconds, if that target is below 35% health, it will explode and deal like a huge chunk of damage. Once you pick up the Unholy 4-piece in the new tier, that's going to be even more damage because it gives you a buff whenever it triggers. In a single target fight, you want to use this as much as possible when the target is below 35% health. Like, there is nothing which is higher priority than pressing Soul Reaper when the target is below 35%. This means that you shouldn't really, you know, spend all your runes in your execute window, because then, you know, you might have a situation where you're sitting waiting for runes when you really want to press that Soul Reaper. Yeah. It's also worthwhile to press Soul Reaper on the target that then dies, as long as you have the 4-piece. This will also trigger the buff, but you won't get the damage, but you do get the rune corruption proc, so that's also good. Without the 4-piece, don't do it, not worth the snipe. Finally, we have Army of the Dead. Huge cooldown. This is very, Death Knight here. You summon an army of little ghouls that come and fight for you. Use this at the start of a fight. So I will go over this in the opener, but you use it and then you press all the other cooldowns, and that kind of buffs your army a lot, and that's a big point of it. We will be running Army of the Damned, that talent that reduces Apocalypse, like that I talked about earlier. This will also reduce the cooldown of Army of the Dead. It's kind of the main point we run that. This means that after 4 minutes in the fight, your Army of Dead will come up again. What you want to do then is press Army, and then after 5 seconds, you want to press all the other cooldowns. Important there has to be 5 seconds between them, otherwise you don't get full overlap. This means that sometimes you need to hold on to Army to wait for your other cooldowns, and that's going to be fine. But it's crucial that you time your second Army with your other cooldowns. Let's talk a little bit about Covenant abilities as well. That's an integral part of 9.2. Usually, just use them on cooldown. That's like the best description I can make. They do quite a lot of damage. They are worth to press, but you don't generally need to play around them a lot. In my advanced rotation guide, I'm going to talk a lot more about this, because Night Fae, for instance, has a lot of gameplay that can be associated with the build if you choose to, really dig yourself into the Night Fae build. But generally, use them in cooldown, you're going to be fine. Let's take a look at the opener. Get a bit of a, specific example of this. We are going to start with casting Army of the Dead. Don't use that like several seconds before you engage the boss. Like as you run in, as soon as you get into melee range, that's when you press Army. We do this because Army only costs 1 rune, so we don't need to wait to gain back those runes as we used to do like expansions ago. Also, it works best because then after a couple of seconds, we use all the other cooldowns, and then they buff the army, and we get big damage. It's really nice. Anyway, army, and then you do double Festering Strike. This is both to build runic power, give some time between army and other cooldowns, and also prepare for using Apocalypse later. Once that we use those, we use Unholy Blight, Dark Transformation, Apocalypse, our normal 45-second trial cooldowns. We then follow up with the Covenant ability, and then go with our normal rotation. The potion, if we use that, it goes with Blight, and our ratio goes with either Blight, Dark Transformation, or Apocalypse, doesn't matter too much. That's the opener. Okay, so now let's talk about AoE and Mythic Plus. So the difference in AoE and Mythic Plus is quite substantial, because our rotation is much more kind of set in stone. Every single pack you engage will be a new boss you engage with an opener, and kind of follow through in the packs. A very specific number of moves you like to use. To start off though, we have 2 abilities which become relevant in AoE scenarios. We have Epidemic. This is very similar to Death Call, as I said previously. It also is affected by Sudden Doom. It spends your runic power in AoE. It works by exploding every single target you have your dot on. This means that having a dot on everyone in AoE is much more important than a single target. It also kind of explodes on everything around it, which means that it scales very well with target count. It does, as we say, quadratic scaling up to 9 targets and then linear afterwards. It's a very big part of our AoE damage. Furthermore, we also have Death and Decay. This is an AoE ability with drop down, which sits there for 10 seconds. And when we stand in it, important that when we stand in it, not the bobs, our Scourge Strike will cleave to 5 targets. The whole AoE rotation is essentially about building runic power so you can press Epidemic to do build damage, as well as putting on your Death and Decay and then you're spamming Scourge Strike to do AoE. How we do that is that we start off with engaging a pack with double Festering Strike. We do this to start generating runic power to start being able to spam those Epidemic. We follow up with either pressing Outbreak or Unholy Blight to apply our dot. Generally, we will have Unholy Blight ready, but it's a 45-second cooldown, so if you pull very quickly, you need to sometimes use Outbreak as well. We then use Dark Transformation. This is a big AoE cooldown, great for dealing AoE in Mythic Plus. We then follow up with Apocalypse. This is obviously pure single target, skip this if the pack doesn't live for long, because then it's really not worthwhile. We then follow up with using our Covenant ability generally, and then we start spamming Epidemic. Those Festering Strikes we used earlier, the Outbreak or Blight we use, that all generates runic power. So now we will be sitting at 60, 70, 80, depending on what you started with. So you can start, hitting Epidemic to drop that runic power down. Once we can't use Epidemic anymore, we enter our Death and Decay window. The way we do this, we essentially have quite a long time between using our Festering Strikes at the start. We spend a lot of runic power, which gives us runic corruption proc, which means that at the end we were sitting at low runic power and a lot of runes ready. That means that we can pop down Death and Decay and then spam Scourge Strike, because we have all those runes ready. We don't need to care about overcapping runic power. It sets it up perfectly. Still, you can generate a lot of runic power in your Death and Decay window, especially if you have a lot of wounds on other targets, which means that we might risk overcapping runic power. We don't want to do that, so even if you are in Death and Decay window, do press Epidemic to avoid overcapping. Never press Festering Strike in your Death and Decay window, it's not worthwhile. Even if you don't have any Festering runes on anything, press Scourge Strike, because the cleave damage just does so much. Once you're out of the Death and Decay window, hopefully the pack is dead, but if not, just start building wounds and bursting them, and then spend your runic power on Epidemic. So very similar to the single target rotation, we only swap out using Death Cult for using Epidemic. Alright, that was the Unholy Beginner's Guide for 9.2. I hope you all found that useful. Do let me know down in the comments if you like this video, if you have any questions, anything at all really. Leave an upvote, downvote, depending on what you thought about the video. Do consider subscribing. You can always find me on the Accura's Discord, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.